So this time around, we want to improve our validation, and we want to do a few things, actually. So right now we have this. It displays an error message. It displays a nice red around it when there's a problem, and that works great. So we want to add that same kind of logic to all of these. We also want the form to repopulate with user-entered information after an error is detected and the page is displayed. So we want the form to be partially filled out and show errors where errors take place. And we also want to simplify our method of checking for required fields. So let's get started. So I'm going to go back to my code, and I'm going to first of all go to the Make Reservation page. And I'm going to think about how I can display information on this particular form. So this part of the form right here, which is the first name, I want this to display whatever the user entered if they've entered information, but there's an error, and I'm redisplaying this form. So how do I do that? Well, let's go back to our handlers. And you'll remember here, when I re-rendered the template, I actually passed it this data object. And the data object is a map of type string interface, which means we can look up things by string and we can store anything we want in there. And we stored one value in that map, reservation, with the value of reservation, which is this, which was pre-populated with the user's information, whatever they entered on the form. Well, we can do a similar thing up here when we're displaying the reservation page with a GET request. So when we first come to that page, we can actually create a variable called var empty reservation that's of type models.reservation. So that is an empty reservation, but it has all the necessary fields. So then we can just create another map. So we can say data is equal to make map string interface and put a value in there. So data reservation, and it's important that it has exactly the same name that I'm using down here when I say data reservation. So I create that, and in that I store my empty reservation. And then I just pass that as data. So now I have an empty reservation the very first time this page is displayed, which means that I can come in here, and on this input I can use an attribute we haven't paid attention to so far, and it's called value. So what is the value to be displayed when this form is rendered? And well, that's going to be equal to my reservation. Now, how am I going to get the reservation out of that? Well, the simplest way to get the reservation out of my data passed to the template is to come up before I'm going to use it, but in the same block, so in the content block, I'm going to declare a new variable using a $sign. Kind of feels like PHP, but it's not. And I'll just call this res. And that's going to be equal to, I'm assigning it the value of index.data, which is from my template data, and inside of that I have a reservation. So I'm storing the value of my empty reservation the first time this page is displayed in a variable called $res. So I can copy that, come down here, and paste it right in here. Put my double brace brackets around it, or curly brackets, or whatever you want to call them, res.firstname. And then I can just copy this and do it for all of the fields. So I can come down here for last name and change value to res last name. Make sure there's a space there. Do the same thing here, and this one is for email, so it's res.email. And again, case matters because it's actually named email with a capital E in the models in the model. And then phone, res.phone. Now if I save that and stop my application and start it up, does it compile? Yes, it does. So let's go back to our form, reload the page so we know it's a new page, a blank form. And this time I'll leave first name blank because that's the only required field I have right now. We're going to make that better in a minute. And I'll put Smith John at s.sm.com, doesn't matter, and then some phone number, 555-333. Now when I submit this, these should be repopulated. And they are. I get an error message, but these are repopulated. So I need to fix this error, but I don't have to retype all this. And that's great. Now, how did that work? Well, let's go back to our handlers. So back to our handlers, which are right here, and hide this, and look at when it's rendering it the first time. So in our roots file, let's start right from the beginning. When I hit this page for the first time, make reservation, I'm going to the reservation handler, which creates an empty reservation, stores it in my data variable, and passes that to the template along with an empty form. So all of this is basically pristine. There is no useful data in there at all. And that's exactly what I want the first time the page is rendered. When they post the data, now it's calling this handler, make reservation post, and it goes to post reservation. And that one says parse the form, create a reservation variable that's of type models reservation, and store whatever they entered in there, whether it's good, bad, or indifferent data. If they entered nothing, it'll be empty. If they entered the wrong information, it'll be the wrong information. Then I create a new form, pass it through my validation, which has one rule right now. It has to have first name. And if it's not valid, I just pass that reservation object that I created here, and I pass the form that I created here. So, because there's information in both form and data now, it displays on the form. And that's all there is to it. So let's go back and clean a few things up. First of all, I want this same error message to be displayed for all of my fields, whatever the error message may be, but I can't use first name here. I have to use last name, which I got to spell right. Same thing for email. Might be a different error message, but I definitely, if there's an error, I want it displayed. And the same thing for phone, which is phone. Okay? And I also had this little bit that goes inside the class. So it puts that nice coloring around the input. And look at that, I misspelled label everywhere. L-A-B-E-L. That one's right. L-A-B-E-L. L-A-B-E-L. And my IDE automatically fixed the closing tag. Yours might not. Check. L-A-B-E-L. Okay. Inside class form control, I can again put that logic. With form errors get, this time it's last name, so change that to last name. Nothing else changes. And for this one, with form errors get, this time it's email. And then for phone, inside that class, and this time it's email. And that should work. So if I come back here now and reload this, reload it this way by clicking up here in the URL bar and hit enter, and try making a reservation, now I should get an error message for only the first one, but it should work. But if I add the required for these three, then it'll work for those as well. Now last time I said, when you look at the handlers, which are right here, when we're doing the check, I said, it's really awkward to have to put one command for every single required field. And I suggested that it might be better in our forms package to either change the has or to add a new function in there. So how are we going to do that? Well, it's actually easier than you might think. All I'm going to do is create a new function, and I'll put it right here. Func, and again, it has to point to the form. So we're a form pointer, the receiver. And I'm going to call this one required. And this one is going to take one name, one parameter, fields, but I'm going to make it of type ... string. And you haven't seen that yet. It doesn't return anything. This is called a variadic function. And a variadic function says you can have as many types of string as you want here, which means I can pass it 1 required field, or 5 required fields, or 50 required fields, and it will do everything I want. And what I'm going to do in the function is range through that fields variable, which might have at least one thing in it, but it might have 10 things in it. So I'll just go for, and I don't care about the index, so I'll use the underscore to ignore it. Field is assigned the value of range fields. And what do I want to do inside there? Well, let's get the value of that. So value is equal f, which is our form object, which we got from our receiver, and that has a function called get, and I can get the key of the string by string, which is field in this case. So if I have first name, last name, email, phone as parameters passed, the first time I come through here, value, which I'm going to spell right, which I'm eventually going to spell right, value will say, go to the form object right here, this receiver, call the method get, which is right on that, it's right in this package, forms, and get the field named first name. Okay, so I've got it. Great. And I say, really simple stuff. If, and this is a package we haven't used much, but we will be using it more, strings is a built-in package in the Go standard library, and I'm going to call trim space trim space. And all that does is trim space from either end of the string. And if the string is empty, we'll have nothing. But it'll give me everything I need in here. So it removes extraneous spaces that the user might have typed in by mistake. If that is equal to nothing. In other words, if that form has no value, and of course I have to put the value in there, what I'm trimming. So when you trim the value, when you remove the extraneous spaces from the variable value, which is currently assigned to first name, if that's the first parameter passed to it, if that's equal to nothing, then what do I want to do? Just add an error. F errors, and I'll call the method add, and I'm passing it the name of field, which is what it's, when we range through the list of fields, it'll be whatever that field currently is, and pass an error message. This field cannot be blank. That's all I have to do. And I don't have to do anything else, because if this condition is never met, this adding of an error will never fire, which means I can go back to my handlers and don't use this, just comment that out. I'll just say form.required and pass in the fields. First name, last name, and I'll leave one out. Email, I'll leave phone out. Okay, so I'm passing that now. I'm not calling the has function, and I'm going to change that in a minute because it will be useful later on. But I'm just calling this. If any of these have an empty string for their value, then form will have an error added to its errors variable. So let's restart this. Close the application, start it back up, go back to our page and see if we did anything wrong. So I'll reload the page and I'll just try submitting the form. And look, they're required. Oh, I made a mistake on the form one somehow, which is why I'm testing it this way. Let's go back and fix that. So that'll be on the make reservation page. And I said on the last one, see, I left email there when that should have been phone. So I can just go back here. It should reload the page, rebuild the cache on the load, and it does. And look at that, only 3 required fields because I left phone out. So that works really well. But what if I fill some information in? A, B, C, and D. And it gives me an error. Let's find out what the error is. It's got to be in somewhere in my template. Form.errors.get phone, ID phone. That looks okay. What I want to do here is just start commenting things out. So I comment that out, and I reload the page, and let it repost the information. Still got an error there, so it's not in there. Save that. Reload the page. Still have an error. Comment that out. Reload the page. Still have an error. And now I'll comment this last one out. Oh, you know what? I'm dumb. Let me uncomment this. Let me just undo all that. Of course, there's no error. When I reload this page, it's blank because I passed validation. So I need to fail validation in order to reload the page, which means I need to go back and uncomment this last one. Reload the page. There we are. Now, this is required, this is required, this is required, this is not. So I'll put one in here, one in there, leave that one empty because it's required, and put one in there. So I should get A, B, and C, and an error displayed on this. And I do. That works really well. What if that's not the only validation I want? What if I want it to fail if you don't have at least 2 characters or 3 characters in first name? Well, we don't have a validator for that yet, so let's go write one. It's really easy. We'll go back to our forms package or forms page, and we'll create a new validator. And this one I'm going to go with, well, I'll just write it from scratch. I don't need to copy and paste. Func F pointer to form, and I'll call this one min length, which will check for the minimum length of a string. And it needs to know 3 things. First of all, what's the field? That'll be a string. Secondly, what's the minimum length you want? And I'll call that length, and that'll be an int. And thirdly, what's the request? And that's going to be R, and a pointer to HTTP request. So I'll pass that in there. And it's going to return bool. Even though it doesn't have to, we're going to do that, okay? So, how do we do this? Well, X is assigned r.form.get, whatever your field name is. So that gets us a string. And then we just check to see if it's long enough. If len of X is less than length, what do I want to do? Add an error once again. F.errors.add, and it's for a field, so we pass in our field name, and the error is, this time I'm going to use my format.sprintf package, or function, because I need to give them a more meaningful error message than, oh, your field's not long enough. Well, how long does it have to be? We might as well tell them. So we'll say this field must be at least %d characters long. And then we'll replace that placeholder, %d, with our int, which we called length. There, so we add that error, and we'll return false. Even though we're not using this bool, at some point this might be useful information. Otherwise, we return true. So if this never gets executed because the minimum length is met, that requirement, then it returns true. Otherwise, it returns false, and it stops processing because we return that function. Return from that function. So let's give it a comment, min length, and it says checks for string minimum length. Okay, so now I have this min length function. Let's go use it. So I'm going to, on this page, make this be at least 3 characters long. So go back and find my handlers. There they are. And I can get rid of this comment because I'm not using it anymore. How do I add another rule to my validation? Well, I just call form again, one of the methods on form. Form.minLength. My field will be first name, and the minimum length will be 3, and it also expects my request. So I'll pass it my request variable, which I have because I'm right in a handler. It's right there. Stop the application, run the application. Go back to this form, reload the page by highlighting the URL and hitting enter so it doesn't repost the form data. And I'll put in a first name that's not long enough, A. And I'll put in a last name, B, and an email, C, and we'll leave phone empty because it's not required. So it should give me an error on this. But there's actually 2 errors being generated. One is, actually no, there's only 1 error being generated on this one. So I can leave it empty right now. So this, if I do it this way, it's going to generate 2 errors. The first one is, this field is required and you've given me nothing. And the second is, there's actually a minimum character length requirement on this field. Well, which one is it going to display? It's going to display the one we added in first, because when we call get on our where is it here? It's under our errors, I think it is. When we call get, we're returning index 0, which is the first thing in that slice. So here, when I filled this out, the first error in that slice is the field cannot be blank. Now let's put a character in there, which still is going to fail because it's not at least 3 characters long. This field must be at least three characters long. And now if I fill it out, it'll submit it and we'll get a blank page. All right, last thing I want to do right now is to go back to our our forms. And I said I was going to make a change to required. Well, not required, to has, but I need a comment for required. So I'll put a comment in here. Checks for required fields, okay? And it is under has. I said, well, I don't want to add an error for this one necessarily, and I don't want to add an error for this one. This will become a useful function because there are certain fields, like a checkbox, for example, that are actually handled differently than a text input. So when you put a checkbox on a form, if the checkbox is checked, then that value, whatever the input is named, the input type equals checkbox. If I call mine agree to terms and conditions, that variable, agree to terms and conditions, is passed as part of the post request. But if it's not checked, it's not even included at all. So you can't do anything with it. So this has will be a useful feature for us to check whether or not submitted form data includes a certain field. So I'm going to leave that one alone, except for removing that error. So now it's available to us, and we are good to go. The last thing we need to actually check on this make reservation form, the posting part of it at least, is that email is really an email. And we'll do that in the next package, or next lecture, and we'll do it by importing a third-party package called GoValidator, which is really good, time-tested, it's been around for a long time, and I use it every day. And we'll do that in the next lecture.